Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pick and Drive Rugby podcast. We're two diehard rugby fans, actually three tonight, having a weekly chat about all things Aussie rugby. We're real, family-friendly and positive, so get involved.
Get involved.
Now, we are super excited to be here on this new platform, this new method of bringing this rugby news and content towards or to your ears and eyes and faces tonight. But the great thing is we are joined by our good friend, Mitch Rev Evans. How are you tonight, Rev?
I feel like a huge weight has been lifted because Trans Tasman might not have been everything it's cracked up to be, but the Wallabies squad is out and it just looks like a perfect reward for sitting through all those rugby matches, just seeing those names and getting the chance to talk about them. So very excited.
And that will be the focus of tonight's episode. So there are a few things we're going to track through. But before I get to talking about kind of who we are, what we're doing tonight, Mitch, can you take us through our social platforms?
All right. So we are on Instagram at #pick_drive_rugby. We're on Facebook at the Pick and Drive Rugby podcast page. And we're also on Twitter at @pick_drive_rugby.
Thanks, mate. Now, I'm loving the fact that we already have a couple of people that have tuned in. So thank you to our dear listeners who are involved or our viewers who are watching us now. Viewers, how good is that? So throughout the episode, we're going to be tracking through the Wallabies squad announcement, talking about some of the big ins, big outs, who might be on an injury ward that should have been in the squad and has been left out. So please leave your comments via whatever platform you are accessing us from, and we'll try and get to them throughout the pod. But before we do that, we have the all-important Super Rugby Trans Tasman tipping competition that we need to give a quick update on. Mitch, again, can you quickly take us through that?
All right, so round 5, we have Liquor Box, who took out the round with the yellow cap on 9.25 points, closely followed by Digger, and then Dead Set Dingo, both on 8 points. And third spot was shared by 3 people this week. Ando, you were on 7.75 points with Hoagie and Jumping Tim Slim. So it's getting tied up the top there. Ando mistakenly thought that it was the end this week, but we do have a final. So we won't announce this week who's taken it all out. But next week, you'll have to stay tuned because we do have the Trans Tasman final.
Which would be super exciting. And just looking at the overall positions, I'm currently sitting in 7th, which I'm way too proud about. Mitch, again, remind me, where are you?
44th, I think, at last checking.
50?
54, I think. Yeah, 54. Not on the bottom, but holding the table up. Someone's going to do it.
Not on the bottom. Okay, cool. Well, tonight, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on the Wallabies announcement, which happened at 1:30 today. And it was pretty enjoyable. Were you guys able to catch it live? Rev, did you see it live or did you catch up on it later in the day?
I did get it live. I was just actually walking my wife and dog out to get picked up. She was going to a party, and I was like, it's going to start soon. I better have it on my phone ready to go. So I'm sort of walking the dog, phone in one hand, just watching the stand stream. And I'm really impressed with how it came out. I'm sure you'll discuss what they did that was quite different this year. But really impressed with how they did it and just the whole stand package for it.
Yeah, and I think we might move on to that to begin with. So, Mitch, I know that you had a pretty busy day today, mate. Were you able to actually see the announcement video and the way that they got all the different players' names? Well, actually, not all, and that's an interesting point that we might touch on as well. But a lot of the players' names announced?
Yeah, so I didn't get to watch it live, but I was out for lunch and a bit of an afternoon activity, which was fun. But got home and got straight on to Stan Sports and watched the replay, and I was really impressed. It was really cool that they had like a little video that they had gone around to different community rugby games and different just schools and things, and they got fans to actually announce the team, which was pretty cool. It was a little bit unusual how they did it though, because there were some big names there that were inclusions that weren't actually spoken. They were just on the screen, which I thought would have been something you would have highlighted, but maybe they were late inclusions. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the thing that a few people have pointed out, that if your name wasn't announced by one of the fans, does that mean that you weren't actually in the thoughts of the coaching staff until the last minute? And so does it mean you're not actually considered central and a key part of the squad, known well in advance? So that's a really interesting point that's been nutted out. I reckon that Stan, next time that they'll do this, if they do try and reprise it again, they'll just have like every Australian rugby player's name just read out by a fan, so then they can just mash the footage in from anywhere they need to. A couple of my students were actually called out in the Eastwood They were training
cool.
with Eastwood. And so one of the boys that gets lifted up in the line out, he's one of my students. And another guy that's packing the scrum in Eastwood colours was one of my students as well. So that was pretty cool. I can't wait to have a chat with them on Tuesday when we're back at school. But regardless, let's actually get into things now. So we are going to, and you know what, let's jump over it this way. Let's get into and have a look at your Wallabies squad. So here was the official announcement that has gone through with all the information here of the different players. There were a couple of really, really big players who were not included. So let's just start off with the biggest outs. Rev, who do you think is the most unlucky person to not be in this squad?
It's pretty hard to single it down to one person. I was looking through the list, and obviously we had a few players that were out for different reasons. And I thought, given there wasn't the inclusion of Pete Samu, who is already a big loss, I thought for sure one of the best fits for that spot would be Liam Wright. Obviously captaining the Reds. He had a bit of time off with injury, but he's come back as really solid at 6 and at 7, has leadership capabilities. And he's already got 5 tests to his name, which, while it's not a lot, it is quite a decent chunk compared to some of the other back robbers. So I was pretty surprised to see that he wasn't included. I'll leave him as the biggest out. I'll let Mitch discuss his biggest out, because there's a few players that probably should have got a look in.
Yeah, so I was surprised that Liam Wright wasn't selected there, and I guess we'll talk about it when we go our biggest ins, but I think Michael Wells snuck in and stole the spot play that Liam Wright had, and I do wonder if that comes down to the versatility that Michael Wells brings, being able to pack down at 6, 7, and 8, where Liam Wright doesn't really fit the sort of 8 mold. But we can talk that a little bit later. I guess outside of that, biggest out for me, Pete Samu was a big one, but we kind of expected that with the injury ward that he's not playing at the moment. Folau Fainga, I thought, was a big one that was surprising. Folau Fainga and Alex Murphy, both of those players, I thought one of them would have got included in this extended squad, and both of them not being in there is big for me.
Looking at the hooker situation, it is pretty interesting to see the difficulties that a lot of people, the coaches seem to have had in picking somebody. We were even considering that Dave Parecki might be a bit of a bolter to get into the squad, but he, again, hasn't made it and hasn't got in, mostly because of the ankle injury, I think, that he picked up last week. And so there's been some really helpful information where the players have been grouped according to their positions, which I'm just going to jump to now. So right here, hopefully you can see it, and it's easy enough for people to check out. But basically, we've got the props: Alan Alatoa, Angus Bell, Pone Farmasili, Scotty Seo, James Slipper, and Taniela Tupou. So let's start with them. How do we feel about them being the six props for the Wallabies? Rev?
My first thought with this was when I was putting together my 38-man squad before the squad got announced, I thought they'd definitely go for more than 6 props, because it's quite a lot of action, over 11 days to have 3 test matches. It's a lot of work for the front rowers. From this 6, I'm pretty happy with 5 of them. I do think Pone Farmasili is quite lucky to be in there. He hasn't played much of the Trans Tasman, if any of it, because he had the ban that saw the end of AU come across to Trans Tasman, and then for whatever reason, he just hasn't been getting picked for the Rebels. They've been opting for Elof and Van Neck. So I would have thought either they'd go for Harry Johnson-Holmes, who's a pretty established scrummager and definitely a big work rate player, or even another loosehead in Tom Robertson, because he's played, I think, 5 test matches at tight head as well. He's capable of going on both sides. But both slightly more experienced than Pone. So I guess they're looking at him as a development player and they want that extra bulk, but he's probably the only one that's a little bit of a shock.
I was a bit surprised to see Scotty Seo in there. I don't think his form for the Brumbies has been particularly strong this year. It's been partially hampered by injury, and I just don't think he's been as effective in a scrum as a Wallabies prop of his experience, in my mind, should have been. Great guy, great player, but not performing at the standards that we would expect of him. Mitch, were you surprised to see Scotty Seo in the squad, or were you?
I was surprised that Seo was there, and I thought maybe Harry Johnson-Holmes might have been that inclusion, being that he was in the squad, the 40-man squad earlier in the year, and he didn't make it through. Now, I wonder if that comes down to some work-ons that he was asked to work on and maybe didn't quite meet that criteria in the last few weeks. But he has been playing big minutes for the Waratahs too, so it is a little bit puzzling there. One of the things that Dave Rennie has highlighted around this squad and I think it will be important to bring it up now as we move through, starting at the props, is that he has picked players on their potential, not just their form. And I think that's why he has brought in a player like Scott Seo, and even potentially Angus Bell and Pone, because he knows what they can do, and he's hoping to get them into the system, get them trained up, and then improve on the performance that they're currently putting out in Super Rugby Trans Tasman, building into, I guess, later in the year.
Rev, you're starting 2 props. And let's go, you're starting hooker as well, and then that'll transition us into the hooker chat.
I think for the front row, we just want experience and size. So I'd still go Slipper, Brendan Pangaromosa, and Talian Latupo as my starting front row. I think I always had Alatoa above him, but I just think Tupou's in such good form. He's such a big unit, and they really do want to combat this French side with that size in the set piece. So I think he might get a look in.
Mitch?
I'd be starting Taniela Tupou at 3 and Alan Alatoa. Now, if we go into the hookers, I'd probably be starting Brandon Pangaromosa, particularly for that first test against France.
Yeah, and that's the interesting one, the BPA heading overseas at the end of the year. There was a lot of questions about whether or not he would actually be a part of the squad, and he obviously has been picked. So I think for him, they've gone in terms of experience. Now, a really interesting person who's got into that hooker position is Lockie Nos Lonergan. He has had a bit of a breakout season so far in Super Rugby AU and Trans Tasman as well. By no means is he the finished product, but he is someone I'd argue is more of a development player, but will almost definitely see minutes considering we have 3 games in 10 days coming up quite soon. Now, Feleti Kaitu, I rate him highly in every aspect of his game except his line-out throwing. So I wonder if that is going to be a bit of a liability on the international stage, but regardless, I think it's well deserved that he at the very least is in that squad. And considering there's only 3 hookers, he will get game time. So that is an awesome inclusion for him. Why don't we shift now into the second rowers? So there are only 4 picked within the squad. We might speak to that a little bit later when we look at some of the loose forwards. But you have Matt Phillip, Lukan Salakaia-Loto, Darcy Swain, and Sitaleki Tamani. Sitaleki Tamani coming back in. When was his last game? 2011? Was that the stat that I heard?
2013, I think it was his last test.
13, brilliant. So we've got Matt
I saw something today that said it was like 2,761 days since he's played for the Wallabies.
I'm getting sick of the day counts. I just want the years. They're doing days for everything.
You're a maths teacher, though. Can't you convert that by 365?
What's the minutes? Yeah, what's the minutes for that and the seconds? We need to
That's asking way too much. Times it by 1440. I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but it's a lot.
Come on, mate. You're a human calculator. You should be able to do this. Now, Matt Phillip has come back from playing with Pau in France and has rejoined the Wallabies straight away. Now, he was at the top of his game when he left for the 1-year contract, and I'm super excited to have him back in Australian rugby, and I think it is deserved. I just wonder if we'll see him in the first match, or if we might actually see the Lukan Salakaia-Loto and Sitaleki Tamani combination to start off with. Mitch, who do you think would be starting for the Wallabies if you had the choice to choose?
If I'm choosing, I'd be going with Lukan Salakaia-Loto and Sitaleki Tamani, just as you said, Ando. I just don't think Matt Phillip's going to be quite ready to go just yet, particularly first test. I think we might not even see him in these French series. We might see him later on in the Rugby Championships later in the year.
Yep. Rev?
I actually would go the same locks, and for a similar reason. I just think Phillip started all the tests for us last year under Rennie, so obviously Rennie does like him, but just not having played with the Australians doesn't have that same sort of connection with the players. Plus, Sitaleki Tamani, I don't see him really as an impact player. He doesn't have a lot of energy or quick legs. He's just a hard-working forward, so I'd probably rather start Tamani and then sub him off for Phillip, after 50 minutes or so.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good call. And I think one great thing that's a comment that's come in from Bastard Sheep is there's only 6 front rowers and 4 second row. So there's not much room for injuries, which I think just means that we're going to have a significant level of if players are injured, we'll just call them into the squad. I mean, that actually leads in really well. What we might transition to now is just some of the questions around the injuries that we have within the squad. So we have Jake Gordon that's been picked. We have, who else was picked?
Isaiah Parisi?
Yeah, Izzy Parisi as well, supposedly dislocated his shoulder last night for the Waratahs. Jake Gordon from the
Fekete left the
previous
field
week.
last night as well with a bit of a limp and went straight up the tunnel. So I haven't heard anything today around what has happened there.
And
But he's
Lockie
been named as
Swinton
well.
copped a red card too, and we obviously haven't heard from the judiciary yet. So it's quite likely that he'll miss a minimum of 3 matches, which takes him out for the France series. So let's just make the assumption. Let's go through those one by one and say that they're injured, and who do you replace them with? So, Rev, starting off with Jake Gordon. He's out. Who's your replacement?
Well, the great news is he's already been filled in by the Pick and Drive favourite player, the Golden Son, the Golden Child, Ryan Lonergan. He's already in the squad as backup for the injury, which is great news because he's just got a really nice little passing game. He's a great kicker, obviously, from box kick, but especially off the tee. And he's young and exciting. So I think it really was between him and Joe Powell. And Joe Powell's obviously is 27 now, and he hasn't really been given much of a chance. So I think it's time to sort of build for the future.
Which is pretty harsh on a 27-year-old quality player in Joe Powell, but I also hear what you're saying with that. Mitch, let's move it down to you and say you're needing to replace Lockie Swinton. Who do you replace him with?
Who do I bring in? Number 6, probably Fergus Lee Warner.
Yeah, cool.
From the Western Force. I think he was a big one that missed, in terms of players that didn't make the cut. He was probably right on the edge there. And I think he's probably one of the players that's been told to wait and see, and is probably the player that will be called in if there is injuries, particularly in the second or back row.
Yep, good call. I was thinking that as well. There's a part of me that really wants Liam Wright to be in the squad because I think he is a very quality player. But if you're looking for more of a like-for-like replacement, then Fergus Lee Warner is more of that kind of hard-edged defensive kind of enforcer that Rennie seems to be looking for. And who else were we mentioning? Remind me again.
Parisi.
Parisi, thank you. So, I mean, for that one, that's a pretty tough. There's not many other players in Australian rugby who are similar to him. Rev, who would you be replacing him with?
Well, the toughest thing is his replacement, someone that would have been in the squad, would be Pataya, but he's obviously injured as well. I think the only other 13 you'd probably look at, and it's not really a like-for-like, is Kyle Godwin. He's been really dominant for the Force since going back, I think, and he's just got that nice mix. He's a good squad player because he can play 12 and 13. He's even played a bit of 10 as well. But he's actually shown that he's got a bit more of a running game. He used to be thought of as a bit of a playmaker, but he's really broken through quite a lot of tackles and even a few line breaks this season. So I'd probably be looking to him if Parisi's out.
Fair enough. Okay, let's continue with our look at the various positions. And let's head across now to the loose forward. So you got Michael Hooper, Rob Leota, Fraser McWright, Izzy Nasserani, Lockie Swinton, Rob Valentini, Michael Wells, and Harry Wilson. Now, for me, I just want to start off with the Michael Hooper thing, okay? Because there are a lot of people that are claiming, that continue to claim that Michael Hooper is a waste of space, that he should not be included within this conversation. And yet again, he has been picked up as the captain, no less, of the Wallabies. So, Mitch, what do you think on this front? Are Dave Rennie and the selectors completely out of their minds, or does the random punter on Facebook really know what's going on here with the quality of Michael Hooper?
I will say one thing. I was very impressed with Michael Hooper's performance in the announcement today. Yep. He seems like he's been completely rejuvenated. This break to go and play in Japan is exactly what I think he needed. If we had seen Michael Hooper stay in Australia and play for the Tars, captain them through or led them through the season that the Waratahs have had, I think we would have a completely different Hooper sitting there. He would probably be more shut down, less open. He just seemed similar to sort of James O'Connor now that he's back. He just had this new lease on life. He was relaxed. He was really sort of sure about what he was saying. And it just seems like a weight's been taken off his shoulders. So I don't know if we'll actually see Michael Hooper first test against France. And I don't know. I personally wouldn't be selecting him to start. I might be going with Fraser McWright in that 7 spot and maybe easing Hooper in the second or third test. But the way he was answering the questions, the way he was talking about the intent, the way the Wallabies are going to move forward, talking about the direction they want to go in this new year, the competition they're coming up against, I think he's the best option at the moment. He spoke very well, and I was really impressed with him.
Yeah, and if we look back at his form for Super Rugby AU and for the Wallabies over the last, say, 24 months, he has, as Buster Cheap says, been an absolute workhorse. He is, without a doubt, the engine room of the Australian team in terms of work rate. And whilst we may criticise him in terms of decisions on the field to take points or go for the corner or whatever, those leadership-based decisions can be questioned. I don't believe you can question his rugby ability. He may not offer what we might expect from, say, a traditional number 7, if that's what we're looking for. But the difference in rugby over the last few years within the back row combinations is that you don't need an out-and-out fetcher for number 7 if you have that balance across either the back row or the broader squad itself. We know that BPA is incredibly strong over the ball, so having him as a starting hooker could negate some of the lack of on-ball threat that Hooper can sometimes offer. But let's continue on with some of the back row chat now. And Rev, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of Rob Leota, I have not been particularly glowing in my praise for Rob Leota. Am I wrong? Is there something that other people see? Well, obviously there's something that other people see within him. Like what is he bringing to this squad and how did he make this 38?
I think the thing that Leota's got going for him is work rate. And when Rennie's looking for this dark side that he wants to bring and he wants players to have this energy and they're ready to go, Leota got canned so much at the start of the season because they were playing him at lock. And to be fair, he's 190 centimeters tall. He's 110 kilos. He did an admirable job, but he didn't have really the physique or the work rate for a lock. The times he's played in the back row, he's been pretty solid. So this is where it gets really interesting for the Wallabies and having Leota in there is when they were announcing the teams, I noticed they were going through not just by position, but actually they did the loose heads first, then the hookers, then the tight heads. They're actually going by jersey numbers. And Leota was he was the last lock / first back rower named. So whether they're looking at him as a lock or a 6 is pretty interesting. But for me, given the French side, I think he's got to be a 6, and I frankly wouldn't be giving him a test cap this series. I think he's a good development player, but he's heading overseas, and he hasn't really done enough, as you say, Ando. He's been solid. He's got high work rate, but we've got 20 other players that do that.
Yep, good call. I think the other interesting person is Michael Wells within this too. He's somebody that has had a good season, hasn't, in my mind, been a huge standout, but obviously there's something that the Wallabies are looking for. Now, Rev, I see you shaking your head there, mate. Talk to me, interrupt me, tell me that I'm wrong.
No, he is the player. I'm shaking my head that he's in the squad. He's the one player that I think he shouldn't be near it. And he seems like a nice enough guy. He's 28, he's experienced, and that's what they want. Rennie said he wants players that are ready to go. He's got more experience than pretty much every other uncapped option. But I just think when you are also building for the future, I don't think it's worthwhile having him in here just because he's versatile and he's quick. We've seen him have like a few nice tries because he's been on the end of a nice play. I don't think you get that many opportunities to do that at Test Rugby. So to see Wells getting the spot in there over someone like Liam Wright, over Fergus Lee Warner, even over a younger option like Josh Kemeny or Angus Scott Young, it just doesn't, fill me with a lot of confidence. So he is not in any of the squads that I've named for those 3 days. I'm happy to just see him in the squad helping out and not getting game time.
Yeah, I think he's the biggest dark horse of this whole list, isn't he?
Absolutely.
He would have been the person, him and maybe Andrew Kellaway, that when his phone rang this morning would have been the most surprised.
Yeah, see, for me, it's Rob Leota that is the biggest bolter within it. Just because at least Michael Wells was in the previous Pony squad that they'd put out, and Rob Leota was not in that at all. And to me, hasn't stood out that much to deserve the Wallabies call up. Now, good on him. Okay, hope he makes a good effort of it. But I was really surprised to see him in there. Now, let's continue on and actually get into the backs where the games are won and lost, obviously, within Rugby Union. And let's start off with the halfbacks. So you've got Jake Gordon, Ryan Lonergan, sorry, not Lockie Lonergan, and Tate McDermott and Nick White. So Nick White is obviously the kind of main option there who'll be starting the majority of the games, you would think. But we also have Tate McDermott, his heir apparent, and then Ryan Lonergan is in for Jake Gordon. Any surprises there, boys? Anybody you think should have made the cut that didn't?
I think that's pretty much it, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it for the players. And really, as Rev said before, when you look at a player who we bring in outside of that, there's a bit of a gulf there, isn't there? Ryan Lonergan is the person who slits into the squad if Jake Gordon's not playing. But outside of that, there's a fair bit of talent that's missing to really be pushing for Wallaby selection.
Yep, I would agree with that. Let's shift into the 5'8s, and you have Noah Lolasiu and James O'Connor as well. Now, we had a good shout out for Jock to be the captain of the Wallabies if Hooper is not starting the match or goes off as a sub. Actually, he'll play a full game if he's on the field. But either way, I think that's probably the form combination from all the teams. I don't really see anybody else that should have taken those positions if you're looking at that performances over the entirety of the Super Rugby AU and Super Rugby Trans Tasman. Rev, any changes there, or are you pretty happy with those two?
Yeah, really happy with those two. I think they are the standouts. They've got, the incumbent and the future. So I think if we're putting our eggs in those baskets, I think that makes a lot of sense for building up for both this year and the Rugby World Cup.
Yep, I agree with that. And we have a good comment here from Bastard Sheep again. He's just getting involved. Even if Hooper starts, Jock for decisions. Fair enough. And I think that one of the things that we noticed with the Waratahs when we were watching them last season before Hooper went off overseas was the fact that he leads by example. He's not always the one that's communicating to the team. And so I'd love to see somebody come on, even as a co-captain, someone like James O'Connor, who seems to have had a bit more nous in terms of game management and being able to direct the team around, looking at the scoreboard, what they think they're capable of. Like some of the Reds come from behind victories, particularly against the Brumbies in a regular Super AU season, were incredibly well done. And a large part of that came down to Jock's guidance that he came in. And now I really do just need to point out Nelson H. Dale. Thank you. We tried to dress up and get our hair done. I know it's still growing back, but thank you very much for the kind comments, my friend. You can come on next week. So let's keep on rolling now into the centres. The one of the backline bolters, Lalakai Feketi, makes the squad. Don't think anybody really saw that one coming. Len Ikitau, Hunter Paisami, Izzy Parisi, and Matt Tuamua. So let's start off with Feketi. Mitch, what?
I love this comment from Jason, and I just got to put it out there because I'm exactly the same. He's mad that there's more Waratahs in this squad than Force. And how Feketi got the call up over Kyle Godwin or Ira Simone from the Brumbies is just puzzling to me. I mean, he's had some good moments in the last few weeks, but I don't think he's pushing anyone to be starting 12.
Yeah, that's a big call. Rev, what do you think?
But yeah, it's interesting, especially with, Godwin got that one cap back in 2016, but he's, a bit more experienced. He's been overseas and played a bit more footy over there. Simone, they gave him 2 caps last year and he's a year younger. Like, it does seem like he's building for something. Plus, he's been in a side that's winning. Like, Feketi hasn't done enough to obviously overhaul results for the Waratahs, which, even though you can't pin it all on one player, you've seen Simone make those line breaks and some really damaging carries and some smart kicks. It is surprising. I think Feketi is one of the players that, is a bit of a surprise in there. But at the same time, I do think he's been playing quite well. The partnership he has with Parisi is pretty damaging, and it's something that I think the Tars have as one of the big assets for next year. So it's a shame that Parisi's injured because it could have been interesting to see those two form maybe a partnership in the Tuesday test, when they're naming perhaps not their strongest side. So I'm happy to see him get a crack. I do agree. I think it's a bit odd, though.
I just wonder if the French are actually going to name. I'll go in and you jump in. I just wonder if they're going to name the French are going to name their strongest side in the second match, and so I wonder if we might actually name a bit more of, say, an experimental team in the first game and actually save our A team for the second match. I'm not sure, but Mitch, sorry mate, I cut you off.
Oh, I just have a theory that Dave Rennie's choosing him on potential, and he sees something in his game, maybe his ability to break the line, similar to Parisi, that he wants to bring him into an environment where he's going to be around players who are also a step higher than the Waratahs this season, and give him extra game time, give him a little bit extra support, maybe work on some of those little nuances of that spot, his kicking game, his ability to break the line, get the offload, that kind of thing, maybe even his defensive work. And he's hoping that by bringing him into this squad, he will develop, because the Tars season has just been hopeless, as we all know. And I don't think there's been a whole lot of improvement for a lot of the Waratahs players this year. So maybe he's one of the players who gets pulled into this squad on the potential that he will improve his game.
And I think, to be fair, he and Parisi, like you said, were actually one of the bright spots of a horrific Waratahs season. And the combination that they had in midfield was really effective and really strong. And I think that if they were able to replicate that combination on the international stage, then it could have been something worth trying. But with Parisi's injury now, I just don't think that Fekete gets a look in. Because if he doesn't have that combination and that continuity with the player outside of him, then I don't see his spot in the starting team worth it, in my mind. Yeah. Rev?
Well, yeah, I think the challenge for him is he's probably going to have to get game time if Parisi's not there. But looking at the centres, they're kind of lucky that they've got Tamua that can shift back there because he's been playing a lot of the season at fly half. You take him out of the equation, Paisami's got 6 caps, and then Fekete, Parisi, and Ikitau are all uncapped. So no matter what way we shake it or put it together, we're going to have a very inexperienced backline. And I was really pro having Paisami inside centre and then maybe a Parisi or Ikitau 13. But the more I look at the backline, I think the more Tamua is going to have a role to play in this French series. Just we need some experience back there as much as his form doesn't deserve it.
And that leads us to a really good question from Jason Sherman stating, I reckon Tamua is very lucky to be in a squad. That wasn't a question, Jason. No question mark, thank you. But regardless of that grammatical error, I fully agree. His form over the last month has been dismal. And we've spoken about it on our pod before to the effect of he has been the Melbourne Rebels for the entire season. Everything has had to go through him, and not because of greed or anything like that, but because of a lack of quality inside and out. The injury list that they've had has been pretty horrific. And so I think he is picked because of his experience. If you look at, like you were saying, the rest of the centres, they're really not that experienced. You need someone like Matt Tuamua to be in there. But let's shift across now to the outside backs. And you have Tom Banks, Filippo Dongunu, Reece Hodge, Andrew Kellaway, Marika Korobete, Andy Muirhead, and Tom Wright. Mitch, can you start us off with Andrew Kellaway? Why is he in the squad?
He brings versatility. He can play fullback, he can play centre, he can play wing, and he can do all of those quite consistently. So he's put himself in form by coming back and playing quite well for the last few weeks for the Rebels. And should there be an injury to a player like Tamua or Reece Hodge, he has a little bit more experience than some of the younger guys. He's been around Super Rugby level for a few years now, and he's gone overseas and also got some experience over there. So he's probably been knocking on the Wallabies' doors for a little while, but there was a few other players that were really cemented in that backline that weren't giving him the game time. So I think this is a good opportunity for him to get some game times, to get a few caps.
Yeah, Rev, are you on the same form there? I mean, he did have a fantastic Super Rugby season before COVID hit. He was the top try scorer across the entire competition.
Yeah, I think he had something like 8 tries in 7 games or something like that. It was really impressive how he started, and we've got to think back to 2016, it might have been, where he went on that spring tour as a development player. I never got a cap, but he's been involved in Wallaby squads before, and he's sort of just always been on the cusp. And I think now with a few players having gone, he's a perfect fit. And what sums it up better than anything really is the game against the Crusaders on the weekend. The Crusaders demolished the Rebels, but Kellaway was that sort of bright light in defence. He chased down Will Jordan from a ridiculous distance to stop a pretty certain try. And then there was probably 2 or 3 occasions just on the wings where you could see someone's going to make a break, and he just made this really last-ditch effort tackle. And it's something that's really underrated, I think, and probably could see him get a chance on the wing, just given perhaps some of the defensive frailties of Dongunu or someone like that.
And I think what that leads us to is a really good point here from Jason, that there's really not been anybody stepping up to take fullback jersey off Tom Banks. Campbell, because of the interchange with Hegarty, has been in and out of the starting team for the Reds. Who else would you really be picking? I mean, the Rebels have had, what's that English guy's name? Worth? At fullback for a couple of games. They've had Pincus there for a bunch of games after Hodge got injured. The Force have had Jake Strawn, Rob Carney. They're just players who either A, aren't Australian, or B, haven't had the consistency of game time to actually get into the squad. So now that I think about it, the selection of Kellaway, who has some form within the competition previously, and I have no idea how he was going over in Japan. I'm assuming the Wallabies setup was actually watching him a lot closer than we were. So they've got a lot more evidence for it. But it makes sense if he's basically considered the backup 15 for the squad.
Maybe we should have selected Mark Nwanganitawasi.
And watch the place burn down. Oh, we shouldn't laugh about that. We love you, Marky Mark. It's good stuff. You're a good man. But let's keep on going. And what I wanted to do now is shift across to something that the legends at Rugby Fixation put out. So perhaps, Rev, you can talk us through this a little bit more, what you did and why and what you learned.
So this is something I put together off the back of AP Cronje, who did a piece similar for the Springboks squad. And he was sort of talking about this idea patch that everyone has leading up to World Cups and Lions tours, where you've got players that are sort of between 26 and 31 that have more than 30 caps. And that's sort of that sweet spot of experience where you're not the seasoned veteran that's on their last legs, but you're also not a fresh-faced player that's had no test experience. So for the Springboks, they've got 15 players currently in that demographic, whereas we've got 8 people, and some of them are sort of pushing the boundaries of the age. So obviously we look at players like Reece Hodge, Alan Alalatoa, and Marika Korobetti right in the center of that graph. They're sort of in that sweet spot of they're 26, 27, and 28 respectively, and they've all got between 30 and 50 caps. So they're, sort of doing a nice job there of just showing the ideal kind of players you'd have coming into a World Cup. And obviously they're going to get a bit more experience. Then we've got a little group of players that's pretty much just Salakai Loto, Tupou, and I guess at a stretch, Tom Banks with 11 caps. But Salakai Loto and Tupou, they're in that spot where they're a little bit younger, and by the World Cup, they'll be perfect. And then you've just got a cluster down the bottom. I've had to do so much rearranging to try and get them all in there. But we can just see, even with 39 players picked, 2/3 of them have less than 10 caps. And a lot of them are young. So it's fine because, over the next 2 years, they might get somewhere between 15 and 25 test caps, and they might become quite experienced. But it does show where the Wallabies are at the moment, that I think all the results we get, you have to take with a grain of salt because we don't have an experienced team. We don't even have an experienced squad. Like, we can't pick from players that are really useful. So there's going to be a lot of guesswork here. And I think that's why I call to question some of the players that have been included. When you look at a player like Michael Wells and Andrew Muirhead, they're both 28 and uncapped. So even though they've got the age, they don't have any of that test match experience. It's quite late to be developing someone. Whereas at least Sitalaki Tamani, he's right at the end of the age spectrum, but he's got 18 test caps. He's pretty established. He's been playing overseas. So I guess for me, I did this because I want to see which of these players at the bottom are going to be seen through to the Rugby World Cup. We've had so many players over the last 7 years, that got a few caps in between the World Cup cycles but weren't used, and players that were overused but then never taken to the World Cup. So Dave Rennie right now has a nice group to choose from. We just want to see him pick 23 players that he can stick with for a while, and then another 7 that fill out the rest of the squad.
Mitch, does that change the way that you think the Wallabies will perform when you actually see the lack of experience that we have within the squad overall?
I think there's some questions to still be answered around what squad actually comes out from France. If it's a full-strength French side, we probably will struggle. But if what has been sort of spoken about in the media around potentially bringing a second-grade side and only bringing their sort of finalists over for the third test from the Pro 14, then I think we might go all right. It really is hard to tell, but there are some players there that have the ability to step up and to play quite well on this stage. And we're not playing the All Blacks. So that's a big thing. If we were going up against the All Blacks, then I think that inexperience would be absolutely utilized. But I don't necessarily know if the French team is going to punish us as much, particularly if it's not a full-strength French side, as coming up against a team like the All Blacks or even South Africa would.
And that's one of the big challenges we have moving forward, isn't it? It's just the lack of experience comparatives to some of the other major players within World Rugby. So if the full French team was actually coming down, like you said, I think we'd be getting absolutely pumped. And that second test, if all the top 14 players, such as your Entamax and DuPonts, actually do make it down, that could get ugly. But it also depends, because the French team is freaking notoriously unreliable in terms of overseas performances. Yes, they're a different beast at home, but you never know how they're going to tour, and quite often they're actually horrific when they tour. So it's going to. I really don't know how to predict this, and most of it is due to just the French being French, and I won't go into any cultural stereotype there, but that's fine. Cool. So why don't we now shift across into the broader questions that we had from the locker room. So I'm going to jump through a few of these, and we might just go through these quick fire to wrap things up somewhat quickly. And starting off with Nelson Dale, which current Aussie injury could prove most costly in a series against France? Rev.
The current injury that I think is the biggest issue is Parisi. I think he was our most exciting attacking option in that 13 channel. And so as I was looking on the Wallabies announcement of the squad, it got retweeted 36 times, a lot of times by French people. And in about 80% of the retweets, they translated to mentioning Parisi in some form. So they were scared of him. I think that's going to be our biggest loss.
Okay, cool. That's a good call on that one. Now let's go across to you, Mitch. Why don't we now move to some of the head-high conversations that have been going on around rugby at the moment? There's a great question that's coming here from Mick Ryan. Are those old guard folk who played down the necessity of the new head-high protocols a severe issue, or one that we just dismiss as ramblings of the back-in-my-day generation? As a junior coach who's seen 10-year-olds cop seatbelt tackles, concussions, etc., I'm all for the protocols.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to be doing all we can to prevent concussions, particularly by younger players, and going hard at it at the top level is the best way to do that, because it goes to show if these players are seeing their idols getting away with doing headshot tackles and diving into rucks shoulder first and making contact with head, then they'll go out and do it on the weekend and expect it to be the same. If they can see that their big favorite rugby players are getting red carded and yellow carded for doing those sort of things, then it makes them second guess their technique. And that's what we need, because we need to start grooming this generation coming through, that protecting the head is the most important thing for the longevity of the game and also the safety of the players as well. So yes, I think it's good.
Good, mate. Well, let's shift across now back to you, Rev, and we're going to be hitting up a question from Man Bear Pig, who's a liquor box in our tipping competition. Question for the locker room: should we allow overseas players to be picked for the Wallabies? Question has been asked plenty of times, and what are your thoughts, especially thinking of how younger players who sign long-term deals would feel if they missed out?
I don't mind it as long as there's some sort of quota. I do agree with Rennie where he says that if we just open the doors to anyone in the same way South Africa or Argentina do, it's just a free-for-all and people are going to go to where there's more money. If they can still play for the Wallabies but get an extra $100,000 a year, why wouldn't they? So I think there needs to be a cap. I kind of like the idea last year of just having 2 players, because it does sort of provide an incentive for those players overseas. They need to be playing at the top of their game, which means if they get picked, they come over in great form. Or they need to realise, hey, I'm not as good as Skelton or Karevi or McMahon. I might just go back to Australia so that I can, at least lay a claim there, and hopefully, work my way into the Wallabies. So overseas players is fine as long as it's capped.
Yep. Now, I might stick with you on this one, Rev. Following up from Liquorbox, what's the biggest disappointment for the entire 2021 season? For him, it's the Reds failing to beat the Tars in a trial match. It ruined a perfect season for the Tars.
His biggest disappointment just from any Super Rugby side. For me, I think it's not having the gap between Super Rugby AU and the Trans Tasman. That still really lingers as just a really poor sort of thought, and why it wasn't planned ahead in advance. There was no way that the teams like the Brumbies, Reds, Chiefs, or Crusaders were going to come out as well as they did in the first round because of that quick turnaround. And for the Chiefs and Crusaders, it was a bit different, I guess, because the Crusaders had the Brumbies. That sort of cancelled out a little bit, but the Crusaders had the home advantage. And then for the Chiefs, they got really quite lucky to get away with the force, but had they had an extra week to prepare, that's suddenly a lot better for them if I'm, laying claim to being a Chiefs fan. So I think just having an extra week in between just would have seen it become a lot more competitive and a lot more even, because that first week just sort of wrote the Reds and the Brumbies off from the get-go.
Yep, I can understand that one. I think it's a really good call. Thanks for not picking on the Waratahs then, mate. Appreciate it. Now, Mitch Foster, let's head over to you, mate. And we've got a big question here from John Cooper that I might break down into some smaller component parts here. So starting off with the first part, did we see any progress from the Aussie teams?
Yes and no. We did see, I mean, the Reds got that victory against the Chiefs, and then the Brumbies got the victory against the Hurricanes. So we saw some improvement. A lot of that Reds performance could be put down to the cards that the Chiefs got, and the fact that they was pretty much out of the game by halftime, although they did come back quite quickly in the second, quite strongly in the second half. But overall, I wouldn't say we've done enough. It's been a disappointing year for Australian teams. There has been chances for us to get more victories and come close, and we haven't been able to nail it. So I would say we're not quite there yet. We started slow as a general. All Australian teams started slow, and they slowly began to adapt as the season wore on. But I still wouldn't say that this last weekend of Super Rugby Trans Tasman was the closest we saw. So we haven't done enough to adjust quickly enough.
Yep, fair enough. Now, John Cooper also asked, he's heard rumours of some of the young fringe players from the East Coast teams heading over to the Force. So that is John Bailey Kunzel, Rhys-John Pasatoa, and Isaac Fines Leliwasa. So the, 9, 10, 12 backup access or third level access for the Brumbies are heading over to the Force. I still haven't seen anything like properly official, but it was talked about in the commentary over the weekend. So it is official, but no one's just like put a post up or announced it properly. So then the other question for you, Mitch, is should Aussie rugby teams have places in their teams for Pacific Island players that can't be poached for the Wallabies? I believe there are rules for foreign players that they can only stay in one team for 2 years. That rule should be waived, maybe 4 players max.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I think it would. It's a difficult one because on the one hand, it would theoretically lift the talent in the Australian teams. And you look at a team like the Waratahs, we would do a lot better this year if we had some big barnstorming back rowers or second rowers from Pacific Island to really increase the tempo. But on the other hand, you then got two Australian players who don't have the opportunity to play first grade because they're behind Pacific Island players. To answer the question, what I personally think, I think we do it. I think it's a good idea. We bring them in. 2 spots isn't enough to cancel out the opportunities for the Australian players. They'll still get chances in the squad. They'll be able to be rotated in throughout the season if as Australian rugby, we're doing what we need to be doing by rotating players and giving everyone a fair go. But and we need to be doing more to increase the level of rugby played by the Pacific Island as well. There's some great players in the Pacific Islands who are getting poached by the European teams who are then through residency laws going and playing for the European nations and not being able to play for their home Pacific Island nations. And if we can do something that allows them to stay in or close to the Pacific Islands and still ply their trade and play rugby and then be eligible for Tonga or Samoa or Fiji come international season, it's a win-win for everyone.
Yep, I hear that. So I think that brings us to the end of the pod or the video for the stream. I don't even know what to call this thing anymore for tonight. I have had a load of fun. Can I just quickly do a massive shout out to Bastard Sheep, Chris Lamb, Jason Sherman, Ruben Leshosa Black as well. Up the Blues, let's go. And who else?
Up the Landers.
There were some other people. I thought he meant the Waratahs by that one. The Waratahs, obviously. So
New South Wales Blues.
New South Wales Blues. That's it. So can I just say thank you, everybody, for getting involved. This was the first time that we've done something like this, so I think it's gone okay. I don't think there's been any major hitches, and please tell us if there are. We are always welcome to take on board your feedback. Mitch, thank you so much for being here as normal. Rev, one of our favourite guests to have on. Thank you so much for coming on board with this, mate. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
If you want to get in touch, Twitter is always the best way to do that. So at Rugby Fixation for the podcast account or at Mitch Evans 94. I think I've just been tweeting nonstop about Wallabies since 1:30. So feel free to get in touch and have some conversations there. Always keen to chat and get into data and stats. So love an argument. Get involved.
Good, mate. Good. And that's what Twitter's for, isn't it? That's definitely what Twitter's for. Well, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next weekend. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.